These men and women have come home to Greece after 30 years' exile in Eastern Europe. Between 1947 and 1949, they fought on the left in a bitter and tragic civil war in Greece. They lost, and now for the first time they can tell their story.
When we came back to the village, we were talking about the civil war and remembering the evil that happened. Brother killed brother. Is there anything worse than that? There isn't. We lost so many children in the civil war. 80 children were killed in this village, and brother fought brother.
I can't forget everything. Every night I go to bed and I talk to myself. I start from the beginning and I go all the way through to the end.
Late in 1940, the Italians invaded Greece. The Greeks repelled them, and for a while were Britain's only ally against the German-Italian Axis. But in May 1941, after the fall of Crete to German troops, the whole of Greece came under Nazi control. The Greek king and his government fled abroad.
We didn't want to be humiliated after our victory against the Italians. It wasn't just the students who felt it. All Greeks felt the same. We didn't want the swastika, the symbol of fascism, to infect the Acropolis. We were so shocked to see it up there that we wanted to bring it down. We chose the day when the Germans occupied Crete. The moment Crete was occupied, we said, we must take it down, now.
The resistance against the German occupation started within weeks. It was also a national liberation movement against the return of the dictatorship of General Metaxas, who had ruled Greece from 1936, and against the return of the king who had supported him.
People hated the dictatorship of Metaxas and the king. Together they oppressed the Greek people. We didn't want in any way to go back to the same tyrannical regime, which was supported from abroad after the liberation. That regime was hated by all Greeks.
The Greek dictator, General Metaxas, had intended that his regime should revive the glories of the Greek past, but there had been disturbingly fascist overtones. Political opposition had been crushed, opponents interned, and civil liberties denied. In September 1941, the Greek Communist Party, KKE, formed the National Liberation Front, EAM. It became the largest resistance movement. Recruitment was by word of mouth.
EAM was organized by those who had been exiled to the islands by Metaxas and who had escaped. They came and immediately organized the first resistance against the occupation forces. I was an engineer, and I joined because a colleague in our office told me, "You know, there is a resistance organization which got started at the Albanian front." And immediately we got organized.
My brother was an old prisoner of the Metaxas dictatorship. As soon as he came back from the Albanian front, where we had beaten the Italians, he said, "Don't just sit there, you must join." And he immediately put me in touch with someone who was organizing resistance amongst actors.
When the Allies imposed a trade blockade on occupied Europe, Greece was particularly hard hit. In the winter of 1941, 300,000 Greeks died of hunger.
It was a fight for survival and food. The first thing we did was to organize free meals. The National Survival Committee was the best idea EAM ever had. We threatened general strikes, and we forced the Nazis to start giving free meals and a portion of oil every day.
By early 1942, ELAS, the military arm of EAM, was building up pockets of armed resistance in the mountain villages.
Ο εκπρόσωπος του Κομμουνιστικού Κόμματος ήταν ο πυρήνας γύρω από τον οποίο δημιουργήθηκε αυτή η οργάνωση στο EAM.
The person around whom the EAM organization was formed was the local Communist Party representative. We were liberals. We belonged to the bourgeois parties. So we hadn't got a clue about underground organizing. The Communist Party, of course, had its own structure and was highly organized. It didn't bother us in the least that it was the Communist Party representative who was organizing us. On the contrary, we worked very well together throughout the struggle against the Axis occupation.
In the village of Ziakas in central Greece, almost the entire population joined ELAS to fight the Italian occupying forces.
The Italians used to come into the village and beat people. We fled from the village and hid in the mountain. The children were crying from hunger. The goals of ELAS were to set us free. We were all peasants, and when we were asked to join the resistance, we did so with heart and soul.
We looked after the wounded. We baked bread all night. We knitted, washed, and transported things. Whatever was necessary, really.
When we came back to the village from the mountain, the Italians had killed all the pigs and cows we hadn't been able to take with us. There was nobody here. Everyone had gone to the mountain. The whole village, when we came back, it was deserted.
In the mountains, recruitment to ELAS was done openly, often inspired by Aris Veloukiatis, a communist who had been imprisoned by Metaxas.
When Aris Veloukiatis came here in 1942 with about 60 or 70 of his ELAS partisans, we all gathered in the square with people who had come from surrounding villages. Aris began to explain the goals of EAM, which were to get everyone to work together to liberate Greece.
He said
that anyone could join EAM-ELAS, regardless of their political beliefs. He also told us that he would attack the occupying forces at any opportunity, that he didn't know what kind of reprisals would follow, but that we should be prepared to try and defend ourselves. Some of the villagers followed him and became partisans. The rest helped the resistance in different ways.
We helped, for instance, at the hospital, washing the clothes and linen, whatever was needed.
I was a teacher, so I moved around from one village to another. I taught the children and tried to instill national pride in them. We prepared the older ones to join ELAS. At the same time, we developed the cultural life in the village. We set up theaters with plays and songs for the children.
On the whole, the clergy in the countryside supported ELAS enthusiastically. Wherever they went, the village priest was always the first to welcome the partisans. Many monasteries were used as hospitals for the wounded partisans. Whatever monasteries had, like animals and food, they gave to ELAS.
Success in skirmishes against the Italian forces brought in more volunteers, but the price of this resistance was high.
Ήμασταν τότε ένα τμήμα ανταρτών καμιά 35.
By then, we were a group of about 35 ELAS partisans, and we were in the mountain villages of Vanasides. The occupying forces have been reinforced by units of collaborators who were trying to collect a tax from us.
Την κυβέρνηση των κατακτητών με σκοπό να συγκεντρώσουν τη δεκάτη, δηλαδή τη φορολογία.
We attacked them then and managed to disarm them and take the food they got and distribute it amongst the villagers.
By now, ELAS was a widespread resistance movement, and in grim conditions was tying down large numbers of German units. It was at this time that British plans for post-war Greece began to clash with those of EAM-ELAS, and the seeds of the Greek Civil War were sown.
The Foreign Office view of the ELAS guerrillas was that they were the military arm of a communist front organization, EAM. As such, they were primarily interested in establishing themselves in such a way as to be able to seize power when the Germans withdrew. The main problem was that we had an interest, a long-standing interest in Greece as part of the Mediterranean, with our lines of communication through to India, Suez Canal, Egypt. We did not want to see Greece handed on a platter to Joe Stalin along with the rest of the Balkans.
Οι Άγγλοι από την πρώτη στιγμή τους εδείξανε εχθρική.
EAM's goal was to make Greece independent, free from all ties.
Έβαζε σαν σκοπό του την εθνική ανεξαρτησία, την επαλλαγή από κάθε δέσμευση.
We knew from the start that the British wanted to keep Greece within their sphere of influence in the Mediterranean, for their own political ends. EAM was opposed to this, and so the British were against us from the start.
In Greece, as in Yugoslavia, the British were confronted with a dilemma. How could they reconcile their short-term military need to work with left-wing resistance movements with their longer-term political objectives of retaining influence in Greece after the war? Churchill believed that the return of the Greek king would be the best guarantee of British interests in Greece. Had there been a powerful royalist resistance in the mountains, there would have been no problem, but in Greece there was none. So the British decided to back a pro-British resistance. Napoleon Zervas was to lead what became Greece's second largest resistance group, EDES. But Zervas only agreed to go to the mountains after being given a 48-hour ultimatum by the British, that unless he went, they would denounce him to the Germans as their agent. The British then sent in a team of SOE saboteurs to set up headquarters with EDES.
ELAS's attitude to us when we arrived, and for that matter EAM, the political component as well, I think they were highly embarrassed when we arrived because they were doing very well without us.
We were
expecting the British as our allies to help us in any way possible. But in fact they tried to divide us into groups, all under British control.
What SOE planned to do with the Greek resistance was to set up more or less independent, small-scale guerrilla bands in all parts of the country, whose activities would be coordinated through British liaison officers who would in turn be under the control of our GHQ in Cairo. This was quite different from the intention of ELAS in particular, which was to set up a large-scale conventional army under centralized control inside Greece, which would eventually form the hardcore of a post-war army in Greece under left-wing control. There was therefore difficulty in reconciling their purposes with our purposes.
From the moment the English became involved, they had one aim: to hurt the operations of ELAS, so that Churchill would be able to impose his plan to get the Greek king back in power, and through him perpetuate Britain's hold over Greece.
In spite of their opposed views, ELAS and the British sometimes worked together with great success, using captured German war materials and British supplies. In November 1942, in a combined operation, SOE, ELAS and EVES blew up the Gogopotamos Bridge, which cut Rommel's supply line to Africa for 6 crucial weeks just before the Battle of Alamein. Meanwhile, the British continued to try to win support for the return of the Greek king. Giorgos Papadagoulis, a leading liberal, was invited to dinner with the British military mission.
We talked about various things. Then the last question the colonel asked me was, why don't you want your king back? I said we don't want him back because he supported the Metaxas dictatorship in 1936, which denied us any freedom of speech and took away all civil rights. And I'm asking you, if your king did such things to you, would you want him? He didn't answer me on that.
Wherever we went, it was quite obvious that EAM-ELAS, either or both, feared that we would reimpose the King of Greece under the protection of British bayonets when Greece was liberated.
In March 1943, the widely respected Stefanos Sarafis was given the military command of ELAS. However, SOE's successful cooperation with ELAS did little to alter Foreign Office opinion that the main goal of the Greek resistance was to establish a communist regime in Greece after the war.
The Foreign Office would have preferred that there should be no resistance whatever. At one point, a leading official in the Foreign Office wrote a minute saying that the best level of sabotage in Greece would be no sabotage at all.
The Greek government in exile was based in Cairo. In August 1943, Brigadier Eddie Myers took a mixed delegation of resistance partisans there to discuss the future of the Greek king. Discussions broke down when the partisans, together with most of the Greek government in exile, demanded that he should agree to a referendum before his return to Greece.
Well, this was an anathema to the king of Greece himself, and it was an anathema to the Foreign Office, obviously. And the king of Greece became extremely worried and signaled Churchill and Roosevelt, who were then at Quebec conference, and they said, oh, you stick fast, no need to sign away your abdication at this stage of the game.
The resistance delegation was dismissed as both irrelevant and embarrassing and was sent back to the mountains. For his pains, Myers was recalled to London and sacked. That same month, August 1943, at Quebec, the Allies decided they wouldn't need to involve Greece in any major military operations, and the Greek resistance therefore became less important. In Moscow in October, Stalin indicated to Anthony Eden that he was not concerned with Greece. This enabled the British to put their long-term political considerations in Greece first. In the War Cabinet in November 1943, it was decided to destroy the power of EAM-ELAS leaders and to build up the power of Zervas, now a royalist. In Greece itself, the continuing hostility between EVES and ELAS erupted into open conflict.
Once the fighting broke out between ELAS and EDES in October 1943, the British authorities decided that ELAS was solely to blame for this outbreak, and therefore SOE was instructed to cut off all supplies to ELAS until the fighting ceased.
ELAS blamed EVES and accused it of collaborating with the Germans.
Zervas certainly had a means of contact with the Germans. He had at least a couple of officers who were members of ELAS, stationed quietly in Ioannina, which was General Lanz's headquarters, General Lanz being the German commander. And these officers were certainly in irregular contact with Lanz and with Lanz's staff.
The war in Europe still had over a year to run. In Greece, a truce was arranged in January 1944 between the two resistance groups. Meanwhile, ELAS had begun to organize society in the territory it had liberated. In April, it set up a provisional government in the mountains. Elections were held, and women were given the vote for the first time.
I remember that the government made beautiful things happen, and we were raised to a higher level. The other governments had neglected the peasants. Beautiful things happened, like voting. I voted, and we helped in the local government in any way we could.
Η αλληλοεξάρτηση και η κατανόηση που είχε δημιουργηθεί.
The solidarity and understanding that were generated up here in the mountains and the enthusiasm for self-government made people so much more aware and sophisticated that those of us who came up from Athens just couldn't believe it.
Στην Αθήνα και βρισκόταν σε αυτό το κλίμα, έχαναν.
Και τότε δημιούργησαν, να πούμε, τα λαϊκά δικαστήρια στα χωριά.
People's courts were set up in the villages, and I was selected to be a people's judge.
Βάλανε και εμένα δικαστή λαϊκών. Και κάναμε, να πούμε, τις διάφορες.
We judged various cases, things like property, mainly small cases, no murders or anything. I did my duty as I have been chosen, and I became a judge. Although I was illiterate, of course. There were no lawyers here in the mountains. I don't know what was happening in the towns. Here in the villages, we didn't have to pay anyone acting as a lawyer. We only had people's judges, who judged according to their consciences.
In general, the people were very pleased with this people's government. We had general assemblies every month, and every villager could air his grievances and criticize the chairman or councillor when he didn't do his duty. We made decisions for the whole village. Whatever happened in the village, everyone had to know about it. That was how self-government worked.
When we started to govern ourselves, we got encouraged, and people woke up, so to speak. We became more active and took more responsibility for ourselves.
We wanted this government to agree to the separation of church and state, and that priests should complete secondary school and have theological degrees. In the meantime, we joined the resistance, and the churches contributed however they could.
There was no discrimination against women. All the girls were working in the resistance together, and the partisans respected the female sex. They had a lot of respect for us.
In April 1944, Greek troops in the British Army in Egypt mutinied in support of this provisional government. Churchill instructed the British commander to put down the mutiny. After 10 days without water, the Greeks surrendered, and the British sent 8,000 of them off to prison camps in Sudan, Egypt, and Libya. The British then hastily arranged a conference in Lebanon, at which they hoped to set up a national government acceptable to EAM-ELAS. The conference was a success. The British nominated the Liberal politician George Papandreou to be Prime Minister, and the delegation from the Provisional Government in the mountains agreed to a coalition government under him, in which they would have 6 out of 24 seats. The British were very optimistic, but in Greece the news was greeted with dismay by the ELAS partisans, who now controlled 4/5 of their country.
Υπήρχαν στο Λίβανο αναγνωρίζοντας τα κόμματα τα οποία δεν διέθεταν παρά μονάχα μια, πώς να το πούμε, παλιά.
Our delegation signed the Lebanon Agreement, which gave authority to the old political parties when they had no power in Greece at all.
Να συμμετάσχουν με 6 υπουργούς.
By then, EAM was the most powerful political force. And yet, the delegation agreed to participate in a government where they only had 6 out of 24 seats. That was the first step in the downfall of our movement.
Although the conference was judged a success, the British were still worried about the extent of EAM-ELAS's power. In August, Churchill wrote, "It is most desirable to strike out of the blue without any preliminary crises. It is the best way to forestall EAM." In October 1944, he went to Moscow to firm up Allied plans for post-war Europe. With Stalin, he made what became known as the Percentage Agreement, giving Britain 90% influence in Greece in exchange for the Soviet Union having 90% influence in Romania. In good humor, Churchill tells Stalin, "It's a pity God didn't seek our opinion when he built the world." To which Stalin replied, "This was God's first mistake." In Greece, as liberation approached, tension mounted between ELAS and the British. One bone of contention was the British attitude to Greek collaborators who had worked with German security forces.
Our attitude was, and we met them before the Germans left, to say if they did not surrender their arms and surrender themselves, they would be arrested and tried as collaborators. We did our best to get them to surrender.
When we started the negotiations, we were putting pressure on Michalagas and the others who could see that there was no way out of surrendering their arms. At that moment, the English officer intervened and said, "You surrender your arms if you want to, or if you don't want to, you don't have to." The negotiations came to an end, and we realized that the Englishmen had turned the tables on us, and so the collaborators didn't surrender their arms.
We failed, I think, because they feared we were too few in number to protect them from ELAS. ELAS would have allowed us to take their surrender if they, ELAS, had taken their arms. In the event they did not surrender, in the event they should have been arrested as collaborators. I think about that time, the attitude of ELAS to us did begin to change. I suppose a single incident brought home to me the change of attitude when Ypsilantis, then a very senior ELAS commander, made what was one of the great Greek gestures of contempt when he tugged his lapel in referring to British troops, which is one of the most contemptuous gestures in the very rich Greek vocabulary of gesture. It surprised me then, it surprises me now, and I think the only reason one can give is that ELAS began to see that the British, who were then expected to come in to the Peloponnese initially, could be a factor, an obstacle to their intention of taking over power.
They usually accuse ELAS of wanting to seize power. It's a stupid view. There was a power vacuum in Greece. There were occupying forces and quisling prime ministers, but the Greek people didn't recognize their governments. The people were creating their own popular power in their own right through the resistance. EAM didn't try to take power. EAM had power.
I have no doubt at all that they could have occupied Athens at the time when the Germans left, and they could have made it very difficult for Allied forces to return to Greece without having to face an opposed landing.
In October 1944, 4 months after D-Day, with the Allies on the offensive throughout Europe, the Germans were forced to pull out of Greece, and the British entered unopposed. The swastika came down from the Acropolis, and in spite of some misgivings, all Greeks welcomed the British troops.
When we got to Athens itself, although we hadn't actually seen a German, we were treated as though we were conquering heroes. And across the roads there were banners saying, "Hip, hip, the British troops." There were posters and streamers from the trees. The walls were all marked with welcoming signs. And as we walked along the streets, we were cheered, we were hugged. Sometimes we were kissed. People came up and gave us flowers.
Ήτανε μέρες ενθουσιασμού, χαράς. These were days of enthusiasm and joy. Και όταν we poured onto the streets, and when we saw the English for the first time on the tanks, in the vehicles, our joy was such that I remember feeling that they were my brothers, my friends, liberators. I trusted them. I remember we danced together. I don't know whether we were dancing English or Greek dances, but we were dancing and kissing.
But within 6 weeks, the British were in armed combat with ELAS and its reservists in Athens. It had been agreed that a new Greek army would be formed, and the argument was over who was going to be in it. For the British, the question was how to disarm ELAS. And for ELAS, it was how to retain its military power on at least an equal footing with the royalist Greek troops then returning from Italy.
I can remember them marching down the main street of Athens, and our great relief that at last Greek troops had come in, and we were not the only people responsible. This was a turning point. Of course, in a way, you might say that for the communists who were participating in the government, it might be regarded as a little bit provocative, in the sense that they realized that the head of their government in which they were participating was bringing his army in.
Σκοπό είχαν με αυτές τις δυνάμεις του Σταγματασφαλίτης.
The British and the Greek governments, along with the royalist troops, wanted to restore the old order in Greece.
Τους Εγγλέζους που είχαν έρθει ακόμα από τον Οκτώβρη στην Αθήνα να επαναφέρουν στην Ελλάδα την παλιά τάξη πραγμάτων, να ξαναθρονιάσουν το βασιλιά ξανά στην εξουσία.
They wanted the king back on his throne because he was the best guarantee of British interest in Greece, political, economic and strategic.
Των οικονομικών και των στρατηγικών των Εγγλέζων στην Ελλάδα.
Churchill was adamant in his support for the king's return and wrote to Eden that having paid the price we have to Russia for freedom of action in Greece, we should not hesitate to use British troops to support the Royal Hellenic government. I fully expect a clash with EAM, and we must not shrink from it, provided the ground is well chosen. Negotiations between the Greek government and ELAS about the composition of the new army continued with bad faith from both sides. On December the 2nd, the Prime Minister George Papandreou banned an EAM demonstration against his demobilization plans. The EAM ministers in the government resigned, and the demonstration went ahead. It was to end in tragedy.
At about 2 minutes past 11, the police suddenly opened fire on them. And they killed 11 or 12 people altogether. There was a man called Frank Pattenham, who was a British policeman, whose job it was to help to train the new Greek police forces being set up, who went along in front of the police and kicked their guns up to stop them firing at the crowd. They were not firing over the head of the crowd, they were firing into the crowd.
Και ξαφνικά εκεί που βρισκόμαστε
And suddenly, As we were in Constitution Square, we heard for a moment the machine guns and the first dead. I ran to take photographs, but I didn't know what was happening. I mean, who were these people killed and by whom? What was happening? Later, within seconds, people gathered and knelt and started to sing the funeral march with fists high up in the air.
On December the 4th, ELAS attacked the police stations. On the 5th, Churchill instructed General Scobie, "Do not hesitate to act as if you were in a conquered city, where a local rebellion is in progress. We have to hold and dominate Athens, with bloodshed if necessary." The following day, the British came in on the side of the Greek government. British troops seized the headquarters of EAM, and from then on, it was open warfare between the British and ELAS.
Αυτοί προσπάθησαν να εμποδίσουν.
They tried to stop us taking action against the security battalions who had collaborated with the Nazis.
Συνεργαζομένων με τα στρατεύματα κατοχής.
Men who the British first regarded as enemies and then later as their allies.
Και μετά τα κάνανε συμμάχους. Μετά το Αγίου Νικολάου στις 6 το Δεκέμβρη.
Later, on the 6th of December, I was at the Makrigiannis battle.
Η μάχη του Μακρυγιάννη. Αλλά για μένα η μάχη του Μακρυγιάννη.
For me, the battle was an experience, a school, a university.
Ένα πανεπιστήμιο. Και τότε κατάλαβα για πρώτη φορά τι θα πει φανατισμός.
For the first time, I understood what fanaticism meant. Rational thinking stops. Man is beyond himself. He cannot think, cannot function rationally.
In the next few weeks, over 4,000 civilians were to die. In the House of Commons, Churchill faced a vote of censure for his actions in Greece. Justifying British armed intervention, he claimed that ELAS had planned to march down upon Athens and seize it by armed force, and that it would have been incompatible with British honour to leave Athens to anarchy and misery, followed by tyranny established on murder. While the arguments went on in London, the battle for Athens continued. The bulk of ELAS was in northern Greece, fighting the royalist Zervas, who had to be rescued by the British and evacuated to Corfu. There were only 3 ELAS units in Athens. A week into the battle, the communist leadership was still undecided about what action to take, and stopped short of ordering all-out attack against the British troops. Nevertheless, 25,000 reinforcements were sent in, and by December the 15th, the British had more than 50,000 troops in Athens.
In Italy, or in any other theatre of war, if you saw a German, you shot at him. I mean, you did your best to kill him, and if he saw you, he did his best to kill you. In Greece, we were a bit ambiguous about this, and so were they, I'm glad to say, as it turned out.
Well, I thought we'd come to liberate the Greeks, but within what seemed to be a short space of time, we were actually killing them. And more to the point, actually British chaps were dying in a cause that I couldn't quite understand.
I think what most of us felt was that we didn't like the idea of fighting against people who were on our side. It wasn't what we'd enlisted for. We would do anything we were told to do, but
It wasn't a welcome idea. The Greeks were on our side. They'd fought beside us in Italy.
As the British stepped up their attack, civilian casualties mounted.
Στις 12 του Δεκέμβρη μας φώναξαν, με τα χωνιά εκείνη την εποχή.
On the 12th of December, the Communist Party called us to a meeting in a school in Kypseli.
Να συζητήσουμε και να πάρουμε αποφάσεις.
We were to decide what line to take and whether to join in the fighting.
Ήξερα ήδη ότι υπήρχαν οι Άγγλοι.
I knew the British were involved, but I hadn't seen them in action until that day when they fired at us with rockets.
Εκείνη την ημέρα μας χτύπησαν. Μας χτύπησαν οι Άγγλοι.
10 people were killed, mainly students and actors. And 12 of us were seriously wounded, including myself.
μεταξύ των οποίων ήμουν και εγώ, πολύ βαριά.
ELAS began to take hostages and shot many civilians whom they accused, often wrongly, of being collaborators. The British had already begun sweeping operations and took their prisoners to the prisoner of war camp at El Daba in Africa.
Εγώ το βράδυ, γυρίζοντας στο σπίτι, πιάστηκα.
On my return home in the evening, I was captured.
Λέγω λεπτομέρειες.
Without going into details, I was caught and sent to Africa. I found myself at El Daba. We were 28,000 of us there, surrounded by barbed wire.
Σε αυτό την κοσμοσυρωή που βρεθήκαμε στην El Daba.
Among the mass of people in El Daba, there were all kinds of people. Most of them were not related to our movement. They did not belong to EAM. Let me tell you about a neighbor of mine who was a milkman. He kept chickens in his yard. This man never got involved in anything in his life. One day his chickens got out and he tried to fetch them back in. A detachment happened to be passing by, found him outside, and picked him up as well.
Allies they may have been, but the Americans in Athens made a point of distancing themselves from British actions.
The American ambassador, Lincoln McVeigh, who had moved in and occupied the quarters of the Gennadios Library, which belonged to the American Archaeological School. He was in there when some British soldiers came in and very thirsty from the fighting, tried to draw water from the well. He ordered them out in no uncertain terms and said, we're neutral, get out. See, that was the attitude of the Americans, this extraordinary thing.
At home, there was an outcry in the press against the action of British troops in Athens. It was led by the Times newspaper.
It so happened that I had the occasion to lunch with Robin Barrington Ward, who was then the editor of the Times, and I did my best to explain to him of my experience, how I tried to explain what had taken place in Greece. He was quite impervious to anything that I had to say. He was totally and entirely sympathetic to the EAM-ELAS position, and he thought that Churchill had gone completely off his head.
In the House of Commons, Churchill said, "There is no case in my experience, or at least wartime experience, where a British government has been so maligned and its motives so traduced in our own country by important organs of the press or among our own people." He defended his action by claiming that for 3 or 4 days or more, it was a struggle to prevent a hideous massacre in the center of Athens, in which all forms of government would have been swept away and naked, triumphant Trotskyism installed.
I suppose there must have been 40 to 50 men and women who were involved in final policy decisions on this, a dozen or so responsible British and American newspapers. They were very well informed, very intelligent, and at that moment in the war, they were enormously motivated to support Churchill's policy if they possibly could. Now, you've got two alternatives. Either one man, Churchill, was wrong on this business, or else 40 to 50 well-informed, well-motivated men and women, all at the same moment and on the same issue, all took leave of their senses and regarded Churchill as being wrong when he was really right. Well, I mean, the saying is, you can pay your money and you can take your choice.
On December the 18th, the Royal Air Force headquarters in Athens was attacked and overrun by ELAS.
2 o'clock one morning. Surrender, comrades! We were waking up much better than the alarm clock, and there were a few shouts. And there we were, I presumed, at war. We dressed, went downstairs to where the rest of the chaps were, and more or less sat about talking about what was happening. No one really knew, except that we were being fired at.
And suddenly there was, like a noise like a Venetian blind going up and down several times. Then everything went quietly, and then quiet. A little while later, it was bang, and the shell came right through the Venetian blind at the window and went into the wall, way over to my right, and burst in the wall. Luckily, otherwise I probably wouldn't be here now.
With RAF personnel now ELAS prisoners, Churchill flew out to Greece with Eden on Christmas Eve. He met with resistance leaders and Greek government ministers for 2 days. The outcome of the meetings was that a regency was set up under Archbishop Damaskinos. Churchill was finally persuaded that the king could not return to Greece before a referendum. Meanwhile, the fighting went on. With aerial superiority, the British gained the upper hand 2 weeks later. On January the 11th, ELAS met British representatives with the Greek government and signed an armistice to take effect from the 15th. Throughout the fighting, the Russians remained silent. Since July, their military mission had indicated Russia's desire not to get involved, although the Greek Communist Party knew nothing of Stalin's agreement to stay out of Greece.
The Soviet military mission didn't get involved at all in our problems. They kept a consistently neutral position to the point of suspicion. When we asked for support in arms and ammunition, the response was always, "We will report your request." But right until the end, in December, we did not receive a single Soviet bullet.
At the Yalta Conference in February 1945, Stalin reconfirmed to Churchill that he had complete confidence in British policy in Greece. Churchill replied that he was much obliged to him for his attitude in this matter.
There was a lack of political foresight among the Greek leadership. They should have seen that the two great powers would each try and get as much for themselves as possible at the end of the war. And in that power game, our leaders should have realized that Greece would be put in the British sphere of influence.
What we can claim is that we left Greece with a free choice after the war. And this is what we aimed to leave them with. Our main purpose, that is the purpose of us as a mission with the Greek resistance, was to ensure that no armed force could seize a monopoly of power when the Germans left. And this we did indeed achieve, and this, I think, is why Greece is a parliamentary democracy today, and not just another East European puppet state behind the Iron Curtain.
I don't think the December events were a revolution. December was really a resistance by EAM-ELAS against giving up what it had won, and against giving in to the British and Greek government demands. EAM was squeezed. December was a forced reply. As the British say, EAM was cornered.
Churchill fought like blazes to retain Britain in the Britain's influence in Greece, and that's what had happened. And of course, I think Churchill too feared anything which had the sort of mark of socialism on it, because he thought anything was socialist was communist.
Churchill is one of the greatest agents of the victory against Hitler. And nobody can dispute his enormous contribution to the struggle against Nazism. But for us, the Greeks, he was the greatest tyrant because he continued to keep Greece tied to Britain.
On February the 15th, 1945, the Greek government met with representatives of ELAS and signed the Varkisa Agreement. The government agreed to an amnesty for all political crimes committed during the December fighting and to remove from power all those who had collaborated with the Germans. In exchange, ELAS agreed to surrender its arms. But neither the amnesty nor the purge of collaborators was carried through.
Η Βάρκιζα παρέδωσε την αντίσταση.
The Varkisa Agreement betrayed the resistance.
Στις δυνάμεις που συνεργάστηκαν.
Our leaders tied us up, hand and foot, and handed us over to those who had collaborated with the Nazis.
Η σωστή επιλογή θα έπρεπε να ήταν να αποχωρήσει από την συσκέψη.
The right choice would have been to abandon the conference and declare that they would continue the struggle outside Athens. We had this option. The whole of the ELAS army was intact.
Όλος ο Ελλάς, της υπόλοιπης Ελλάς ήταν άθικτος.
Within weeks, thousands of ELAS partisans were imprisoned. And 2 years later, in the mountains, came the outbreak of the Greek Civil War. In the closing months of the Second World War, the British re-established their control in Greece. They backed a government in which the Greek resistance, EAM-ELAS, had virtually no power in spite of the fact that it ran 4/5 of Greece and had widespread support. The British attitude had led to armed conflict with ELAS in the streets of Athens. After 6 weeks fighting, British troops crushed the Greek resistance movement. But the amnesty which had been promised never took place. The result was a 2-year drift into civil war. Under the Varkisa Agreement, signed in February 1945, the communist-led ELAS surrendered its arms. The Greek government was committed to an amnesty for political crimes and to removing from the police force all those Greeks who had collaborated with the Germans. But the purge of collaborators did not take place, and instead of an amnesty, the ELAS partisans faced mass arrest. In the mountain villages, right-wing gangs began to terrorize anyone suspected of having been in the wartime resistance.
When ELAS surrendered, the government's men came out here in the countryside with right-wing gangs and did whatever they wanted. They killed people. They demanded that we each hand in 3 guns. I didn't have one. I had already surrendered the one I had. These right-wing gangs weren't officially part of the state security forces. They were part of a parastate. Our people, former partisans, were in trouble, and we didn't know what to do. I was arrested.
I was a young communist in Salonika. The terror was widespread. Every day you could read in the newspapers the names of people killed in different villages and towns across Greece. One kill here, another there. It happened daily. It was almost a routine thing.
They were asking us to hand in weapons all the time. When we told the gangs we hadn't got any, they beat us up. They used to make us report to the police all the time. I went to the police 5 times. This kind of thing went on for almost a year. Some people on our side, the left, also did some extreme things. It's true that they executed some people. The Communist Party was still functioning legally after the Varkisa agreement. But it did so in this state of terror.
What we saw in Greece in 1945 and 1946 was a gradual oppression of the left and all those thought sympathetic to the left by the right wing. The right wing, being in power, used its power as the gendarmerie was formed and the National Guard was formed to ensure that the membership of the gendarmerie and National Guard was sympathetic to the right rather than the left. And increasingly the left, which embraced a broader and broader spectrum of the population, was discriminated against.
Throughout 1945, the British were in Greece in some strength and were largely responsible for appointing and dismissing the 3 Greek prime ministers who held office in quick succession.
There was a time when we were almost literally governing Greece to other people, because first of all the supplies, all the relief, all the food, everything depended on our services. And secondly, there was no properly elected government. There had not been elections for many, many years. You mustn't forget that before the war there was a dictatorship in Greece.
Οι κυβερνήσεις των Άγγλων, έτσι τους λέμε, άρχισαν να παίρνουν έκτακτα μέτρα.
The governments of the English, that's what we call them. They started taking emergency measures. They suspended articles of the Constitution on civil rights. They introduced new decrees and special measures, which meant that the hundreds of former partisans who were arrested could end up going straight to court and then to be executed.
There were thousands of men and women in prison and exiled. Hundreds of men were executed or condemned to death for nothing. The only accusation was that they had belonged to ELAS. It was the English who were in charge of this whole business.
We, the British, had got ourselves into a rather strangely false position in that Greece was a kind of British protectorate, but the British ambassador was not a colonial governor.
In that we advised the gendarmerie, in that we advised the army. If the gendarmerie and the army then discriminated against the left, we could be considered culpable or at any rate sympathetic with that discrimination. I do not believe we were, but I do believe that had we been prepared to intervene more forcibly, as we did at local level, then we could have restrained what became a major civil war.
By June 1945, 49,000 former ELAS partisans were in prison. 3 former prime ministers and the liberal leader wrote an open letter saying that terrorist organizations of the extreme right, which were armed by the Germans, have not been disarmed or prosecuted, but have openly allied themselves to the security forces in order to strangle all democratic thought.
The more the terrorism spread, the more illusions our Communist Party leaders had. I remember in Britain when Attlee led the Labour Party to power in 1945 and became Prime Minister. Bevan was Foreign Minister. The left here said, now the situation in Greece will be resolved.
At that moment, I happened to be in charge of the British Embassy in Greece as the ambassador had gone home for consultation. And to my great relief, within 48 hours,
Mr. Ernest Bevin, the new Foreign Secretary, had sent a telegram to ask me to assure the Greek government that the previous policy would be carried forward exactly as before.
The Allied powers met at Potsdam in July 1945, and the Cold War disputes began. Greece was to become a testing ground for wartime agreements over spheres of influence. The Americans demanded the reorganization of the Romanian and Bulgarian regimes. The Soviet Union replied by calling for the establishment of a democratic government in Greece. Meanwhile, in Greece, the government did little to halt the right-wing backlash. By now, 80,000 former ELAS partisans were in prison.
People who have fought in the resistance were leaving their homes, going to other towns, in the hope of escaping the right-wing gangs who were after them. Others went to the mountains. Gradually their numbers grew, until about 40,000 people were up in the mountains and began to form into defense groups. And from then on, when the army or the police or the right-wing terrorist gangs appeared, they armed themselves with guns to defend themselves.
The Communist Party, under its leader Vafeiadis, swung from one policy to another. They threatened to retaliate against right-wing violence, and at the same time they called for a more representative government. Bevin insisted that the Greek government should hold elections.
When we asked the communist parties for their opinion on what we should do about the election, the Soviet Union, which was the most powerful, said we should take part. Vafeiadis decided then to do the opposite, just what the reactionaries were hoping.
In spite of this advice, the Communist Party leadership decided to abstain on the grounds that the election could not possibly be a fair one.
I think the leadership of the left fell into a trap. I think it was a mistake to abstain from the elections in 1946, despite the climate of terror and the daily killings. Because in response to the terror, many people on the left had already begun to think about responding to violence with violence.
The elections finally went ahead in February 1946, although 10 Greek government ministers resigned in protest, and the Greek Prime Minister warned Bevin that 4/5 of the Greek state apparatus was now in the hands of extreme right-wing gangs. The West appointed a team of independent observers to see the elections were fair. Giorgos Papadagoulis was one of them. The day before the elections, he asked one of the village presidents whether he thought there would be many abstentions.
And he said, "Who's going to dare to abstain? Men will pay a few visits beforehand." As the court representative, I was really alarmed. He said, "Don't worry. You won't witness it. You'll be asleep." I asked him what the men would do, and he said, "They'll knock on particular people's doors. They'll be armed, and they'll simply ask the way to the next village. That'll be enough. Nothing more will be necessary." And so, that's what happened.
In 1946, we voted in the election. On the top of our ballot box, there was a Sten gun. So you can imagine what kind of election it was, and what the result would be.
That's how the elections were conducted. Despite the fact that observers were sent by the British and the Americans, that was only for consumption abroad.
The conclusion which the pollsters reached was that although the electoral rolls were very imperfect, naturally, because there hadn't been an election for 10 years, nevertheless it had been more or less fair, and the outcome was more or less what was to be expected.
Constantine Tsaldaris and his right-wing populist party swept to power. The Communist Party under Vafeiadis dithered. Finally, it decided on a limited mobilization in the countryside.
Και μετά πια, ύστερα από αρκετό καιρό, κατά τον Ιούλη μήνα, Ιούνι,
A good while later, in June or July 1946, the party gave the order to take up arms and fight back.
Και να απαντήσουν ενάντια σε εκείνους που πάνε να τους σκοτώσουν.
So, those who were already being hunted by the right went up to the mountains.
Με σκοτωμό, άρχισε να πας στα βουνά.
And we organized the first key units of the second armed struggle.
Ένοπλου, του δεύτερου ένοπλου αγώνα.
At the same time, any further chance of communist participation in Greek political life was eroded by the way the referendum on the future of the Greek monarchy was conducted. King George returned to Greece in triumph in September 1946.
Αυτό ήταν ακόμα χειρότερα από τις εκλογές.
The conditions under which the plebiscite was held were even worse than the elections. It wasn't even a comedy. You can call it what you want. There was no freedom. People were under pressure. And so they voted for the king.
In October, the Communist Party formed a partisan army out of its existing armed groups. It was led by the former ELAS partisan Markos Vafeiadis. Its goal was to regain the power the left had won in Greece during the Second World War.
Η ένταξή μου στο δημοκρατικό στρατό και ο αγώνας μου κάτω από τις γραμμές του δημοκρατικού στρατού.
I joined the partisan army because for me it was a continuation of what we have fought for in ELAS, the wartime resistance, for freedom and independence for Greece.
When the partisan army was formed, more and more of us took refuge in it. Because it was enough to say you were from the village of Ziakas to get beaten up by the government army.
Any woman who happened to be passing by could get beaten up. What could we do? We got up and left. It wasn't just 1 or 2 days. It happened every day. That's why people joined the partisan army. We followed the army too.
I joined the partisans because my husband had already joined. I believed in its goals.
When the first partisans appeared here, people started leaving to go with them. We had no plans to go to the mountains. No one wanted to go. We had no choice. We tried to get the right-wingers to meet us, to discuss things, and come to some sort of agreement to stop the terror. But they refused to talk.
The partisan army went from village to village, recruiting those who sympathized with the political aims of the left.
The partisans gathered people here in the school. They rang the church bell. They told us that they were taken to the mountains to wage a partisan war and invited everyone to join them. 2 or 3 young lads from here followed them.
The government army had already begun national conscription. Initially it avoided known left-wingers, but soon found it necessary to conscript regardless of politics.
Όσοι ήταν από την πλευρά τη δεξιά, ευχαρίστως πηγαίναν.
Those who were on the right would go happily. Some stay behind and ignore the call-up.
Ορισμένοι εξ αυτών δεν καταταγόταν. Και όταν καταταγόταν...
Still others enlisted. And then when they saw what was really happening, they deserted and joined the partisan army. And they were the best.
Και ήταν οι καλύτεροι.
In the bitter battles which began at village level, the fighting was regularly preceded by shouting matches in which traditional insults were freely exchanged.
Όσον αφορά, ο στρατός τότε φώναζε να πούμε πρόστους, αντάρτες, βούλγαροι, απάτριδες, ξέρω εγώ.
The government soldiers were shouting, "You're Russians, Reds, Bulgarians, you've got no fatherland." While the partisan army was shouting, "You're sold out, you're the Queen's lackeys, you're sissies."
Δεν ήταν όλος. Οι αντάρτες έρχοντας πήγαν...
At that point, the partisans overran the hill and pushed the government company to the edge. And they almost fought hand to hand.
Σχεδόν χέρι-χέρι πιαστήκαν.
In the first months of the civil war, the partisans kept the initiative. This was partly due to the reluctance of many of the government army conscripts to fight other Greeks.
The government army came over the top of the mountain just where the partisans were entering the village and started firing machine guns into the air. They didn't fire at the partisans because they didn't want to kill them.
Ο στρατός
The government soldiers wouldn't fight. They didn't want to kill their brothers. There were lots of examples. Once, a whole government platoon surrendered and then joined up with us. Often the prisoners we took later fought on our side.
Many former ELAS partisans were conscripted into the government army. Nikos Papanikolaou was one of them.
On the whole, of course, those of us who were in the government army were happy when we defeated the partisan army. But I must tell you something. Once I saw 3 government army soldiers crying behind a cedar tree because Captain Velias got killed. It's true that when we were in the government army, we often got upset. Many of us had brothers with the partisans and sisters. People were happy or sad, depending on whether they had relatives or friends on the other side.
The partisan army was by now 20,000 strong. Morale was high, even though they were outnumbered 6-1 by the government army.
In
the partisan army, we had hardly any arms. And in size, we were 0 compared with the government army.
Yes, they were better armed than us. But it was early days, and we had braver soldiers in the partisan army because we believed we were fighting for a better tomorrow.
Throughout the winter, the partisans continued to hold the initiative. Meanwhile, in their embassy in Athens, the British were counting the cost of propping up the Greek government.
We had saddled ourselves with very heavy responsibilities of direct subsidies to Greece for the payment of British troops in Greece and for the functioning of a naval mission, an air force mission, a military mission, a financial mission, a police mission, a legal mission. All that amounted to a considerable sum of money, and we simply couldn't afford it.
So the British turned to the only country capable of maintaining a commitment to the Athens government, the United States.
Well, the British handed over the responsibility very abruptly. Ambassador Oliver Franks called on the State Department one Friday afternoon, while many were leaving for the weekend, and handed a note to our government, which Secretary Atchison said he would deliver to the President, but in a sense handed us the problem of Greece and Turkey. The British said, in essence, that they could no longer continue military and economic aid to either country. And they also told us that if we didn't go into Greece, that Greece would probably fall to the communists within 2 weeks. And we had to have our answer by Monday.
Their answer was the Truman Doctrine.
We shall not realize our objectives, however, unless we are willing to help free peoples to maintain their free institutions and their national integrity against aggressive movements that seek to impose upon them totalitarian regimes. This is no more than a frank recognition that totalitarian regimes imposed upon free peoples by direct or indirect aggression undermine the foundations of international peace and hence the security of the United States.
The essence of the Truman Doctrine, as it was stated by President Truman in his message of March 12th, was to the effect that we as a nation would help those nations, members of the free world, who were struggling to maintain their independence against threats from without, to wit, Turkey, who was threatened by Russia, Greece, who were threatened by minorities from within, who were aided by outside countries. Remember, this was British territory. We had looked to you to run this area, and we got in only because you asked us to do it. But when we got involved, we did it wholeheartedly. Had we not done so, there's no question that Greece would have fallen to the communists.
The bulk of American aid went into military supplies to the government army. 200 American advisors were sent in, and a few months later, a joint US-Greek staff was set up.
Με το δόγμα Truman, την άνοιξη του, αν θυμάμαι, του 47.
When the Truman Doctrine came into effect in the spring of 1947, a new phase began, and things changed for the worse. Things went against us because the Greek government got enormous financial and political help and military aid and equipment.
The Greek state was essentially brought under American control, and such areas as trade unions, foreign trade, the fiscal policy of the Greek state, conditions in prisons, the salaries of civil servants, even Social Security, was really controlled by American officials. Obviously, in the military sector, the control was very, very thorough because the Americans provided not only the equipment but also the economic support for the armed forces, and therefore the Americans had a veto over anything that had to do with the Greek armed forces.
During the summer of 1947, the government launched an offensive, but the partisans still held their ground. In the winter, on American advice, the Greek government began to relocate all the villages in the battle area. Partisan families went first.
My family was taken to Trikala. They lived in a church there for 2.5 years. That was my wife, my father, and my 5 small children.
Well, they came and took us because they said that if they left us, the partisans would come and get us. And they said we'd bake bread for the partisans and help them. I don't know. Anyway, we were moved to other places.
As part of the Civil War effort, the Greek government was now running a chain of island prison camps. By 1947, 32,000 people had been detained on suspicion of having partisan sympathies. In prisons such as these, they were ordered to sign declarations denouncing communism.
I was never charged with anything. I was kept 4 years because I did not sign the certificate of probity. Because I don't believe in saying that I'm this or that, I believe this or that. That's my own business, nobody else's.
Measures became more oppressive. There were courts-martial of soldiers who deserted. There was exile of people suspected of being sympathetic to the left. The island of Trikeri was used as a prison camp for women, but it was an astonishing sight because it indicated the indiscriminate nature of the backlash. There were on Trikeri village women who may have given food involuntarily to the left-wing guerrillas. There were relatives of left-wing guerrillas.
There was a lot of indoctrination and trying to get a signature. The pressure was mainly on uneducated women who had family, someone from the family who was with the guerrillas. There were 85-year-old women with us and lots of children whose parents or one parent had been with the guerrillas at some point or was suspected to be with the guerrillas. Then woken up very early in the morning and taken to the theater and we had speeches and everybody said, now we are going to kill you or you have to sign or you die and so on.
The huge number of conscripts to the government army who were considered politically unreliable were now sent to the island camp of Makronisos. The torture squads of Makronisos were notorious.
Επιστρατεύτηκα το 1947 ως στρατιώτης εθνοφρουρός.
I was conscripted in 1947 as a soldier in the National Guard. And within 4 days, I was sent to Makronisos, simply because I had been in the resistance.
Εγώ συγκεκριμένα έκανα 6 μήνες στρατιώτης, μετά με πήγαν.
I was a soldier for 6 months.
Μακρόνισο.
And then I was sent to Makronisos.
Πράγμα το δικό μου που ήμουν εγώ.
There were 8,500 of us. And life was unbearable.
Που η ζωή υπήρξε αφόρητη.
We would be without water for a week, a whole week.
Κάθε βράδυ 12.
Every night at midnight, Makronisos was full of moans and cries.
Βογγούσε από τα βογγητά των
Some men were killed and thrown into the sea. And the authorities will say they committed suicide.
Μέσα σε αυτό το χώρο των 10 χιλιόμετρων χωρέσανε 9 στρατόπεδα.
There were 9 reindoctrination camps, as they called them.
Κακοποίησης της προσωπικότητας του ανθρώπου.
The system operated to wipe out any individuality and dignity or self-respect that you had.
Δηλαδή της υπογραφής δηλώσεων μετανοίας.
They tried to force the thousands of men gathered in barracks all over the island to renounce their beliefs.
Που είχαν συγκεντρωθεί στο διάστημα αυτό στα διάφορα στρατόπεδα των...
The worst thing of all was that we were tortured by former EAM-ELAS partisans who had been broken and signed a confession.
Διαλέγανε αυτούς που είχαν υποκύψει και τους βάζανε για να εξηλωθούν.
These men got clean discharge papers in exchange for torturing the former comrades. These tortures had no beginning and no end. It was terrible.
In September 1947, the Greek government offered amnesty to any partisan who would surrender. Few did. In December, the Communist Party announced the formation of an alternative government in the mountains. So the Greek government outlawed the communists. The battle lines were drawn. The partisans continued to hold their own, although outnumbered 8-1. Aside from the fighting, they also began to organize life in the territory under their control.
In January 1948, the provisional government set up a teachers' training school here. There were about 60 or 70 of us training to teach the children in the various village schools. We were given tuition morning and afternoon in the different teaching methods and in the courses we were to teach. When we finished the training, we were each sent to a village school.
The countryside was under their control. They'd reopened the schools, they ran a newspaper, they ran an officers' training establishment. They had artillery practice and everything you can think of, really.
Throughout this period, the United Nations had a fact-finding mission in Greece. Its job was to investigate the extent to which the partisans were being aided by communist parties outside Greece, as the Americans believed.
Well, the Greek guerrilla effort, which originally we estimated around 7,000 and which never got over 20, was obviously a minority which had been organized and directed from bases in Yugoslavia and Albania and Bulgaria. It was not an indigenous Greek organization. It was the appendage of a communist organization.
Η βοήθεια στο δημοκρατικό στρατό τώρα ήταν βέβαια ελάχιστη και φυσικά
The aid the partisan army got was minimal. Of course, it was better than nothing. It was valuable, but we have very little ammunition or food.
Ελάχιστα τρόφιμα από τα πυρομαχικά αυτά. Να φανταστείτε ότι ήταν και ο οπλισμός που παίρναμε.
The arms we did get were old.
Ήταν παλιός οπλισμός, λάφυρα πολεμικά.
Usually they have been captured from the Germans during the war.
Λάφυρα γερμανικά και πολλές φορές, ιδιαίτερα
Our machine gunners often had problems because the ammunition was all different makes and didn't fit the machine guns. And they had to make endless different combinations in order to be able to use them at all against the government army.
Για να πετύχουν, ας πούμε, μια βολή εναντίον του αντιπάλου.
The UN Commission was hopelessly divided along Cold War political lines.
They arrived, most of them, with their views already known and their prejudices just to be confirmed. This was especially evident with the Russians, the Poles and the Yugoslav and Bulgarian liaison officers who were attached to the commission. They were on the revolutionary side. The other side disassociated themselves, and this was most of all evident when
we went off to look at Markos's headquarters and to interview Markos. We didn't succeed in doing that because we fetched up in a little village about 2 miles away from the place where from government territory. And Markos, I think, was 5 or 6 days away, and the American, British, and other representatives refused to go further. The Russians said they would go on. So the commission broke up there. One part went off to see Markos, and the other part, my part, went home.
In the villages, both armies sought information on the other's activities. On both sides, the punishment for informing was usually death. The partisans instituted a system of people's courts.
When a case about someone informing on the partisans came before a people's court or a military court, there was proper justice. There had to be sufficient proof. And naturally, these courts did pass the death sentence on some people and execute them.
As the brutality of the civil war spread, thousands of people were made homeless, families divided.
My father was conscripted into the government army. He was on the opposite side to my mother and myself. He risked his life by coming to visit us in the village every night because we were a close-knit family. He loved us very much, but he had to do his 2 years military service in the government army. Sometimes, in the morning, he'd still be with us, and he'd have to hide in the granary until the next night, when he could rejoin the government army unnoticed.
We were caught in the middle. The army used to attack from either side of the village. One of my brothers went with the partisans, and lots of boys from here, aged about 17, 18, 19, went too. Often their fathers were already with the partisans. In 1948, some were forced to join. They would ask you, "Why don't you join? Are you on the other side?" That's how it happened.
The government relocation program was successful. Villages were deserted. Deprived of volunteers, the partisans too began conscription.
When the partisans realized they needed more forces, the older people were put to work, baking. And us, the younger ones, were given guns. I was given a Sten gun, and they trained us for 15 days in the snow, with hardly anything to eat. And then we took part in the battles.
My eldest brother was a volunteer. My other 2 brothers and myself were conscripted. We went to a village where we were trained for a month. Then we were split into units, and we took part in the battles.
Throughout this period, there had been a long tactical argument on the partisan side between the army chief, Markos Vafeiadis, who favored a guerrilla war, and the Communist Party leader, Zachariadis, who wanted the partisans to switch to conventional tactics. Zachariadis won.
Εμένα τον Αύγουστο με καθαίρεσαν από την ηγεσία.
In August, I was expelled from the leadership because we had been arguing since 1947 about partisan strategy and tactics.
Και η διαφωνία μας βασικά ήταν αυτή. Η στρατηγική τακτική μας ποια θα πρέπει να είναι.
Zachariadis kept insisting that we were an army and so should adopt conventional army tactics.
Θα πρέπει να
And he was saying that at a time when we didn't even have a place to rest our heads. I took the opposite view, that we were a partisan army and that one day we might become a regular army. But at that time, we certainly weren't. That was our difference.
Αυτή ήταν η διαφορά μας.
Για μένα, κακώς. Για μένα δηλαδή προσωπικά το λέω.
I think the leadership handled this issue very badly. It happened while we were right in the midst of the struggle. It really shouldn't have happened. And I think it was one of the main reasons why we were defeated later.
A few months later, in the autumn of 1948, the government army launched Operation Summit on Mount Gramos. It was the beginning of a number of set-piece battles in which the partisans were outnumbered 12-1. Under American pressure, the government pilots now used a new and terrible weapon, napalm.
They started bombing the village with about 8 or 10 planes each time. The first time they bombed us, they aimed at the church and the school. When they came overhead, all 150 school children ran out of the school in a panic, crying. And some of us hid in the sewer under this plane tree.
In the daytime, we rested and slept. As soon as it got dark, we went down the mountain and worked through the night building defenses. One evening, we'd gone to camouflage them, and an officer came and told us to go back up the mountain. We did, and as daylight broke, the smoke and the bombs started. Bam, boom, smoke everywhere. Virgin Mary. Airplanes, artillery, shells, mitrailleurs, automatic weapons. It was the end of the world. The end of the world. The partisans had mined the river, and as soon as the government army crossed it, the mines went off. The mountain erupted. The whole mountain was trembling. There was smoke and fire everywhere. The partisans were crossing the river with knives between their teeth. They'd go to the machine gun positions and attack. But the government soldiers kept returning with reinforcements. They had airplanes too. The partisans had nothing. Then we started retreating, going further and further back. And then, after the ceasefire, the men said, "Let the women go down." So we went, and there was a guard from each army standing either side. I saw someone lying face down with his leg cut off, and I said to both the guards, "Get lost, both of you. So you've taken over the hill. What's the good of it?" So many young people killed, mothers who will cry and suffer so much. And the army guard said, "This is war, my fellow fighter. What can we do?" I said, "You fools."
Things were so bad we had to keep a sense of humor. For instance, the reconnaissance plane that always came very early in the morning, we nicknamed the milkman. The next plane, we call it the barrel plane, because it dropped barrels full of napalm, which set the whole area on fire.
There were 17,000 casualties in Operation Summit. For the government army, it was a strategic failure. The partisans returned to the Vitsi mountains and held their ground. Morale was still high. Nevertheless, the bombing of their area, coupled with the fact that the government had emptied all the villages, confronted the communist leadership with difficult decisions about what to do with the civilian population under their control. They decided to evacuate the children to Albania. They said they had no alternative. But at the United Nations, the Greek government claimed the children were being forcibly separated from their parents so they could be brought up as devout communists.
I had a small girl. We were fired on from the mountains with artillery, and the soldiers accused us of hiding partisans. It was treachery. We were supposed to have done this or that. We didn't know what was going on. People were butchered right here, in the village square, and the children saw it all. The partisans were forced to form a committee to take the children away from here.
The army had taken up positions facing us, and were firing continually. Each time we moved, they opened fire. Many of us got killed. Young people, children and women were killed in the bombardments from the government army planes. Then in 1948 and 49, when things reached the worst point, we started leaving. From our village, the children were the first to go. Children from partisan families who had been left here alone with their aunties, whose parents were both partisans or had been killed on one side or the other. They went to Albania.
When I was 5 and a half, I lost the two most important things in life, my parents and my country. I followed the defeated, and I saw things I would never have seen if I'd stayed here in Greece. I went with my mother and my little brother to Albania.
The children left because they were terrified of the planes. Our village was bombarded. I had great difficulty finding the children in the evenings. They'd fled wherever they could. I was hiding in the fields myself. The children wanted to leave. My eldest daughter wanted to go, but I wouldn't let her. What would I have done all alone?
You should have seen what it was like. Mothers and children crying as they parted, like baby lambs parting from their mothers. We let the children go. What could we do? I kept my youngest daughter with me, and every morning she asked me, "Where can I hide today?"
170 children left. They went past Markos and began to sing. We were laughing and crying at the same time. We cried to see so many children leaving. The village was deserted. There was not a single child to help the priest in church.
In 1949, there were still about 20,000 armed partisans, 1 in 5 of whom were women. The government army had 263,000 soldiers, backed by American advisors and officers of the newly formed CIA. The civil war was approaching its climax in the mountains of Gramos.
Look how well the government army planned its attack on Gramos. They cut off the back of our Gramos unit. They started clean-up operations from Rumeli. They advanced to Thessaly and destroyed the Kosaga command. So there was no hope for a large partisan unit to help another by coming from behind or by carrying out any serious diversionary operations.
The odds against the partisans were overwhelming in both men and equipment. In desperation, they formed whole units of wounded men.
They were made up of people who wouldn't have been allowed in any army. They would have been sent home. Invalids, people with multiple wounds, who couldn't take part in any offensive operations. Their job was to stay in the trenches and man the machine guns. Even their retreat was a problem. These units tell you just how desperate the situation of the partisan army was.
The government army launched Operation Torch. The Greek High Command was so confident it invited King Paul and his entourage to have a grandstand view of the final defeat of the left.
We helped carry the stretchers. To tell you the truth, we had no bread. We were so hungry. It was very foggy and pouring with rain. And we were told to go and collect an injured government army officer who was still alive. But as we approached him, what happened? He started to fire at us. The officer, firing at us. I was with 2 partisan women, one of whom was called Flora. We decided to lie down. But the officer still kept firing at us. So we threw stones at him. 2 of us had brain guns. It was such a muddle in all the folk. Government soldiers on one side of us, partisans on the other. Then another soldier went up to the officer. He was Flora's brother. And then she saw him. She called him, and he recognized her voice and shouted, "Flora." And just as he shouted her name, the wounded officer shot him. He killed Flora's brother. You should have seen her. She threw herself on the officer. We killed him. We tore him to pieces. He was a huge man. Then we left the place, and we took Flora's brother with us, even though he was in the government army, and we buried him.
It was night time. We always walked at night, because in the day we would get fired at. Finally, we reached the Albanian border. The army was advancing, our brothers from one side and from the other. I had brothers in the government army fighting against us. We didn't know what to do. We had no choice.
They managed to capture us all together, because of course they had the arms, tanks, planes, everything, while we didn't have even a tank. It was true that we had no shelter at all. We were on our own. And it was our leadership's fault, because they had made us all gather in Vitsi and Gramos. That's why we were defeated and had to cross over into the People's Republics.
We left because our choice was get killed, give ourselves up, or leave Greece.
Orders were given to retreat to the Albanian border. It was obvious we couldn't hold the mountain any longer. So we thought we would move and reappear somewhere else in Epirus, probably in the Murgana. But when we crossed the frontier, we were told to put our guns in a heap, and the Albanian army personnel collected them. It was then that we realized that the war was being stopped for a while. Later, we went aboard ships, but we didn't at first know where we were going. Eventually, we arrived in the Soviet Union, and then we realized that it would be a long time before we would return to Greece, without, of course, realizing that it was going to take so many years.
In Athens, the government celebrated its victory, but 100,000 Greeks had died in the civil war. The left had lost, its supporters in Greece were in prison, and those who fled abroad were to spend the next 30 years in exile.
The civil war was fought for democracy. But there are people who are greedy. Let them burst from their greed. Democracy will come one day.